So this next panel is really going to focus on the results of 3 years worth of data collection, research, youth training, employment, and social enterprise programs across Newfoundland and Labrador. So this project was shepherded by Choices for Youth with support of NLWIC and also the support of many, many community partners across Newfoundland and Labrador. I think the last time we counted, we were up to 3 or 4 dozen community partners that we engaged with through this work. So really want to, and many of them are in the room. So really want to give a shout out to those folks who really made this work possible. So it's my pleasure to introduce some fine folks who are seated to my left. Rory Lambert, who is our training lead with Choices for Youth. Chelsey MacNeil, who is the president of Common Good Solutions and our former director of education, employment, and social enterprise. And Matthew Cooper, who is our evaluation and research specialist with Choices for Youth.
Great. So I'll get us started. This particular project, as I said, initially started in 2019, and it was really about what are the pathways to employment for marginalized youth in Newfoundland and Labrador. And to really understand what we needed to do, we needed to hear from young people about what they wanted us to do. And so we started those consultations 2019, and we've been doing that research consistently, given the changing climate and the change of what young people were facing. We've been doing that research since 2019. So we're happy to share that with you here today. This work was made possible certainly by the NL Workforce Innovation Center, as well as CNA, the government of Newfoundland, and the federal government of Canada. We'll walk you through sort of some of the background and context, talk you through how we did the research, how we looked at doing the research differently from an applied research perspective, but then also with our consultations, talk through our key findings, and then some of our recommendations coming out of this research, and then finally some of the key reflections. Jen? So where we started, and I said we started this project in 2019, which is true. Where it started in 2017 was putting together or dreaming up what this application would look like to the Workforce Innovation Center. And so really we've been on this journey for a while. And really what it looked like at Choices for Youth is that we had 2 social enterprises, Impact Construction and Succeed, which was, if some folks in the room remember or know about Succeed, they make hydroponic units for growing indoor vegetables. And we were we were the manufacturer of the product and fulfillment agency. So we had that very, very small contract. And where we started with those 2 social enterprises, and Impact Construction had been in operation for about 8 years at that point. And we knew that we were doing really transformative work for young people, participating in the Impact Construction training, albeit very much on the job training, and then subsequently getting a job with the construction company to do, what construction companies do, which is we did small scale jobs, demolition work, and mostly asbestos abatement. And what we wanted to know really was a bit more of like, what do young people need to be able to get into that work confidently, get into that work with some training, but then also subsequently, how do they continue learning on the job so that we can meet the outcomes of what we're looking for, which is young people moving on to competitive employment or post-secondary. So we had, I'd say, 1.5 social enterprises in 2017 when we started. And then we had our fabulous support team that was just really forming in 2017. But it was really driven on the crisis end. So it was crisis-driven supports. So when things went wrong with young people who worked at Impact Construction, we jumped in, we helped, particularly around housing, mental health, addictions, food security, and specifically income support, and what it meant for a young person to go to work, potentially coming off of the income support system, and then what cascading impact that had on their housing stability, their access to drug cards and those kind of things. And when a young person goes from that really big shift, our support team were often the ones that were on the phone with income support, trying to see how a young person can still maintain some of those really critical benefits, but then at the same time be able to like realize what their goals were, which was to go to work. So trying to navigate those transitions. So in 2017, we were looking at, okay, well, we're working in a kind of a crisis response. We're not really necessarily like when something goes wrong, we're reacting, but how might we start thinking, I think, more upstream, and how do we prevent some of these things from happening? And what do we need to do? So in 2017, this was really a genesis. Asking all these questions about things that we had was really what motivated us to want to dig and really dig deep into the research to find out what the design can look like of training, education, and employment so that we actually meet some of these barriers, stop reacting, and start planning with young people with what they need. Jen? So our big questions, we had 4 really complicated research questions that I won't bore you with, but I can kind of like collate it into one big question, which was, how might we create workforce development initiatives that work for vulnerable youth? So some of the things we know that a lot of the young people who would come to our door who were looking for a job, the things that they weren't asking for were things like resumes. The things they weren't asking for were things like networks to get jobs. They weren't necessary, but they were looking for oftentimes a job. And so understanding why that job, oftentimes the motivation for needing that job was to have financial stability to maintain their housing. Was to have financial stability, like all of us need in the room, to have a paycheck, to be able to like economically and financially survive in this world. But one of the things that was clear to us is that for a lot of these young people, the experience of work was one of the big gaps. So when a young person came to us looking for a job at like Impact Construction, unfortunately, the barriers that was impacting that young person from getting a job anywhere else were really like more of those personal supports, or that it was not necessarily about not being able to get a job, it was about all the things that prevented you from going to the job. And so Impact Construction as a model, we were able to meet those needs in real time while at work. But we knew like, okay, how do we design something that actually works? So if I referred someone on to, when we were doing how many resumes can you support somebody writing and those kind of things, and the young person's kind of saying, well, the resume is not exactly the problem. So we're attacking the wrong problem. But we really want to unpack that. We knew it in our hearts. We knew it in the practice that you'll hear from Corey a little later on. We knew that in our data collection that we've got to attack the right problems, the right pain points for young people. But in the practices with workforce development, sometimes we're not necessarily seeing that wraparound support. So we wanted to really explore what that could look like. Jen? So our intentions coming to this work was understand our programs, and understand what's missing. And so when we looked at if you think back to that slide, that was 2017, we had 1.5 social enterprises and our support team. And we knew kind of that we were missing some of that educational components, those training components, and really resourcing that well. But we also knew we needed a different training model with some of the things that we've been learning to really think about working upstream as opposed to meeting those crisis supports while young people at work. We also knew that we found out that what was missing in a lot of our work was diversity of employment experiences through our social enterprises. Not everybody wants to work construction. So we needed to think about what the portfolio of social enterprises needed to look like at the same time, so that young people would be able to connect in and want to work in that social enterprise, that they felt connected or interested. We also knew that to do this work, we needed to build provincial partnerships. So if we were going to try and really ambitiously understand what young people need in terms of the future of work. We needed, all of you in the room. We needed partners all across the province to really go as deep as we could to get that feedback from young people. And then finally, building our base of knowledge is really critical. When we design things, the intention has to always be designing with, co-creating with young people, but then also like when we do design something, to test it, and which is what was central to this research project. Jen? So how we did it, our methodology was really kind of in two sort of, well, I would actually say it was in really three. We did some applied research, certainly in our consultation approach. We really wanted to dig deep. We did also a literature review, so a real good environmental scan of the Canadian context of what was happening in workforce development initiatives across the country, what models were out there, and what were the large scale barriers that young people were feeling in big urban communities and rural communities. And so really kind of digging deep. And we did that work with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. And we also had a series of training and pilot projects where we employed a human-centered design approach. So what human-centered design is really that design, that co-creation that I referred to a couple times, where that you really develop, you put the beneficiary first, you understand, you empathize, and then you move into the design phase with them with many feedback loops. Then you get into like a iterative process, you're prototyping and you're evaluating. And so that cycle, if you can think of that like a circle, that cycle is always about iteration, and it's always about, pivoting, uncovering more, refining, tweaking the program model, and seeking out evaluation or seeking out information through good evaluation to help make and guide decisions on what the programs need to look like. So really important framing of how we did it. The other piece is a restorative justice lens. So folks in the room who have experience with restorative justice is recognizing trauma, and particularly in this case, certainly personal trauma, but we also took it from an education lens that a lot of the young people who connected with us who were looking for work and looking for alternative training. A lot of young people, I think last year, something like 65% of the young people connected with us hadn't graduated from high school. We know that at our outreach center in St. John's at Carter's Hill Place, only 4% of young people who connect in with outreach have graduated high school. 4%. And so recognizing that, we know that there's a substantial amount of trauma around the education system as a whole for a lot of the young people that connect in with us. And so we took that lens because we knew we had to do training and education differently to recognize the trauma around the education system, but moreover, recognize trauma more broadly in how we do our training. And then finally, and probably the most critical component of this in these pilot projects is really engaging in a wraparound support approach. And so when a person needs something, or they're coming up against a barrier, or there's, they need someone to talk with, they need someone to support them, to cheer them on. Sometimes they need someone to hold them accountable, to build out their career goals, and to be in that sort of coaching relationship. Our support team really, and to anticipate the challenges, our support team through this research is able to know what that support looks like and how to shape that support so that the young person meets the goals that they identify with. And then we did all of this in probably one of the most critical components of the design of the research approach was a developmental evaluation, taking a developmental evaluation approach. We wouldn't be able to do human-centered design without developmental evaluation. I'll pass it over to my colleague, Matthew, to just talk very quickly about DE and how developmental evaluation really played into the methodology.
Hey, hello, everybody. Good morning. It is an honor and a privilege to be here today to talk to you about this. This has been a very, very long evaluation process. To Chelsey's point, absolutely, we would have had to take a developmental evaluation approach, and I'll get into what that is, but it has been a turbulent couple of years, to say the least. And one of the things that I think is really unique about the situation with COVID-19 is that it's turbulent for literally everyone. There's a real common playing field now. So a little more context on how I came into this. I started with Choices for Youth, doing the lit review for the Forward Together report. And the Forward Together report that we put out in 2020 was trying to take the temperature in the room of how young people were affected with COVID. And it really did influence the research of this project. And so after I did the literature review for that as part of an MBA program from Memorial University in social enterprise and entrepreneurship. And after graduating, I got hired by an organization called Inspiring Communities that specializes in evaluation, specifically developmental evaluation. And they're based in Nova Scotia. And so then I was brought in as to be for kind of a hybrid purpose, to get training to be that evaluator, because I don't have a background in evaluation. So there was coaching and training, and I have to give a shout out to Carrie Patterson and Karen Pyra, who were my mentors and guides, and really, really helped like hold my hand and walk me through this process. Because developmental evaluation, to get into that part, is a pretty new approach to how we look at problems and try to solve them. And so instead of having a very linear approach to an evaluation where you set up a series of questions and then you do the program and then you look at the answers of those questions, a developmental evaluation approach is embedded. The evaluator is embedded right into the project. They care about the project. They're not just an observer. They're a reflector. And so it was my job to watch the project in real time and let folks know how is it going and what's working and what's not. And so as the disruptions of COVID-19 really started to come into effect, the number of pivots that we had to take were unsurmountable because we were getting brand new information on almost a daily basis, which I'm sure you all remember. And so that took a whole lot of sense making. And so that's a major component of developmental evaluation is reflection and sense making. And so we use a framework and we would have DE sessions where we would go into these, go through this framework of what, so what, now what? That's kind of the heart and soul of developmental evaluation. And one of the things that I love about this kind of evaluation is that it tries to take all the complicated jargon out and keep it simple. So that framework is to get together every month and say, what did we do? So what? Why did it matter? Why did that work? Why did it not work? And then finally, okay, so now that we know that, what worked or what didn't work, now what do we need to change or do moving forward? And so like any good evaluation, that DE component can't live on its own. We also, this was a hybrid evaluation. So we did have that traditional lens. We did have a series of matrices to ask very specific questions to count what needs to really be counted and keep track of what really needs to be kept track of. And so we had evaluation matrices that I designed with support from Inspiring Communities on the progress of young people, the impact that our programming had on them, and the outcomes that resulted from those. And so we developed those through a series of documents and files that were co-created, because everything in developmental evaluation is about iteration and co-creation. And so working with Rory and his staff, we said, well, what do we need to know? What do we actually need to really, really track? And so we developed those tracking tools together to really make sure that it was a custom fit to this project. Am I missing anything? Oh, the first step, going back to the beginning, the first step was to get the logic models and theories of change in mind. So we developed a logic model for this project, and that itself was also a very iterative process because it was evolving so much. Like a logic model pre-COVID is going to look different from a logic model after, right? And so that was a really crucial component to make sure that we knew exactly what we were trying to do. I think we're done with this slide. Is this back to you? It's back to you. Thank you.
Back to me. Hi, I'm Rory Lambert. You may remember me from such locations as by that podium over there. And so when we were working through this, we did a lot of consultations across province. We did a lot of surveys and collected a lot of data. Myself and Matt worked very closely to take that data and to figure out how can we take the information we heard from young people and inject it into the training that we want to provide for them, to knock down those barriers for them that they're facing to education and employment in our province. So our first learning was that we needed to invest in that training. And so we developed a framework that we could pilot, prototype, and test out and get responses in real time from young people and from leads at our social enterprises. So we designed programming that was sector specific. When a young person comes to our door and knocks on that door, which is not easy to do, they can then immediately take control of their journey and their path. Are they interested in construction? Are they interested in food? Are they interested in art and design? I always tell them that if they're interested in something, that's all we need. We don't need experience. If they're interested in trades and construction, they can apply for the trades and construction program. I tell them that they would hire me and I can't swing a hammer. So we really want them to be able to make choice when they come through the door. What do they want to learn? What do they want their path to look like? Choice that can then be reversed. They can try something on and go, you know what? This is not for me. I want to try something else. Give me one of your other programs. No problem. So we developed those sector-specific programs. The programs were designed to expose them to different industries, to give them a chance to try things on in a risk-free environment, and just see, is this a good fit for me? We built up the education side of things. I'm a firm believer that I can't be my best self at work if I'm not my best self at home. And that's no different for a young person. So how do I give them the skills to find a job, but also to maintain and hold on to it? And so the education piece kind of came in there too. Also, we work on their GED. If they were missing their high school diploma, how can we support them in getting that very valuable piece of paper? And finally, the power skills. And the power skills are what we call the entry-level skills that a young person would need to walk confidently onto a job site. We can't teach them everything, but what we can do is give them the means to have confidence, self-esteem, and walk in knowing they have something to offer. That's what's most important. And all of these things are framed around our core curriculum. Our core curriculum education piece is based in housing, person, career, finances, and leadership. We're trying to give them as many skills as possible to keep on that journey and stick with it. Next slide, please. So how did we do it? So what we did was we implemented training programs for each of our social enterprises. At this point, we now run 4. We have Impact Construction, the Shop, which is a small manufacturing and production facility. We have Neighborhood, our boutique thrift store, and we have Crust Craft Bakery. So there's a program designed for each one of those programs that a young person can try on, test out, move through the program, and if they complete successfully and they have the interest and the desire to work in that social enterprise, they can then apply for a job. So trades and construction is linked to Impact, art and design is linked to the Shop, customer experience to Neighborhood, and Yes Chef to our Crust Craft Bakery. Now you'll see an outlier there, entrepreneurship. So we run a youth ventures program in cooperation with CBDC, and we're firm believers that entrepreneurial spirit, that creative spirit, ties into all of the programming, that there isn't a job on earth that doesn't have some form of creativity. I truly believe that, and obviously I'm a creative person, so I do firmly believe that everything from doing what I do as an actor and a writer, right down to working in a restaurant, requires a certain amount of creativity. That's what makes us wonderful beings on this planet. Next slide, please. All right, and I'm handing it over to one of these two people.
You think we didn't do this already? So yeah, I'm going to go over our scope. So in terms of research, we did 16 consultations in 13 communities. We went all over Newfoundland and Labrador, and this took a lot of intention because it was really, really hard. A lot of folks didn't want to go out and talk to people in the middle of a pandemic when there was so much uncertainty. So it's a big kudos to all of the folks, and some of those folks and organizers are here who helped get us in touch with the young people all across the province. We talked to 145 respondents to online and paper surveys. Those had their own challenges. We had 3 versions of that survey that got attacked by bots. And so we had to We had to pivot and shuffle and say, okay, we didn't get 7,000 results in an hour. That's not right. And so like shifting through and making sure that your data is clean and good is important, right? And so we have to take those things into account, and protecting that data is becoming increasingly more difficult. And then we had the 3 different tracking tools that I talked about for recruitment, progress, and evaluation. And then along with that, with the trainees, we did a pre and post survey. And so we wanted to know, where are you at now and what are you hoping to get from these programs? And then after they finish training, how are you feeling about it now? And how did the program work for you? And what would you change? And so that we can keep making it better. And I have to say that in terms of how we could have made the training programs better, there was almost never any kind of feedback or criticism other than, yes, please, more. And another important thing about those pre and post surveys is that often folks identified more barriers after they had finished training because they had learned more about what barriers they are facing. So that was a super important component for us. So I'm really happy to say that despite pandemic and limitations on numbers, the 13 training programs resulted in 3,400 paid hours of training for young people. Full-time wraparound supports. We had 88 interventions that were all carefully tracked and documented to help support not just the young people who needed those interventions, but also to help better our knowledge on what those interventions are needed and how to best apply them. And then from our rural outreach, we had 3 places, 3 partnerships, 3 programs. So in Nain, we partnered with Smart Ice for the Power Skills program that Rory just introduced. In Corner Brook, we partnered with Food First NL, the Western Food Hub for Grow Your Skills right here. And in Happy Valley Goose Bay, the Makami Status of Women Council Thrifty Fashions, we partnered with them for our customer experience section. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to hand it over to Chelsey.
Cool. So our second learning was really around this model of scale. So everybody who, isn't around entrepreneurship or community economic development hears this like, you got to scale. And I love this model. It was from the MacNeil Foundation that really kind of grounded us when we were looking at this idea of like scaling and social innovation looks so different than in sort of the traditional senses of scale. And this idea that when you scale up, you're really tackling root causes through the systems change at policy levels. So when we looked at some of the results we had in the interventions that Matthew just spoke about, some of the interventions that we really needed to pay attention to were those in mental health and addiction, in and around a basic income, as well as income support. So the challenges that income support presented when a person was transitioning from being on income support to being on a mail back, and most of the people in the room know what I'm talking about when I say like they go to mail back, and then all of a sudden things become really complicated in their lives with their housing, with access to drug card, future forward. So those things become really complicated. So that's how we focused our scale up, was in and around those systems level issues. Our scaling deep is really the work we did around our consultations. So digging deep to cultural roots to find that meaning, that empathy. We really wanted to go deep to be able to know what those barriers were. But one of the most interesting ones is this concept of scaling out. And so this idea of scaling out is when you impact the greatest number of youth possible through replication, through dissemination, and through resource sharing. And so this scaling out was really what Matthew just talked about with those 3 partnerships across the province. We knew here at Choice for Youth, like we're in St. John's, we're in town. And, when outside of working with doing the research, and we're certainly working with all of our partners to be able to get that research, we felt that we had a values-based decision to make, I think, there. And what we knew is that each community was really different. And each community, although there were some themes certainly that bubbled up in the research, each community was different, and there are trusted partners in those communities. And so when we talked about scaling out, it was really about how might we support the good work being done by someone else in community. There doesn't have to be choices for youth coming in and doing the thing by any means. And it shouldn't be, to be honest, in that scenario. So what we were able to do is leverage our research funds with NLWIC, leverage our funds with the federal government through our social innovation project, and be able to empower other organizations to either start or grow. And so we, with that, we were able to provide employment training, but also employment dollars to the Western Food Hub to be able to employ young people, train young people, support young people. And the same with the Mokimi Status of Women, as well as Smart Ice and Nain with some of the work they were doing. So the idea of scaling out is really about that incredible collaboration that is required to actually move the dial on some of these things. Next slide. And the demonstration of scaling out is we chose to talk about the Mokimi Status of Women Council because we have Stacey in the room, which is so fabulous. We provided some business and operational support. And that's actually a 30-year-old social enterprise. Is that right, Stacey? I shaved a couple years off of that. And so we were able to send our manager of retail and production, Marilyn Taylor, who you get to hear from later, to go up, meet with Stacey and her team, provide some operational supports to Thrifty Fashions, which is this great social enterprise thrift store in Happy Valley Goose Bay. And then we're able to run a customer experience program in coordination and supported by the Mokimi Status of Women Council to support employment in Thrifty Fashions and thinking about what a work integrated social enterprise could look like for their service delivery model. And that was really about that scaling out. And some of the really kind of key and was just really kind of recent learnings or key learnings that we came, that the amount of when we work together like that, there's so much potential with what we can actually achieve. So from there, Stacey and her team were able to access resources for a social worker attached to social enterprise and their other programs. We trained 7 young people. We hired 6 young people, and they've had 100% retention of those employees, which is incredible. They've had increased operational capacity, and Stacey, you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the growth of 300% in their first month in terms of revenue generation. That's incredible capacity. And, you know, wouldn't be possible without great partners like Stacey and her team to be able to really dig, you know, scale deep, and they scale deep every day. And so, and we can assist on the scale up in terms of tackling the systemic issues that are the things that are getting in the way of the good work. And scaling out is supporting, replicating, but also like sharing resources to make these things happen. And there's a lot that's possible. I mean, this is such an incredible example of what sharing knowledge, energy, and resources can do. Next slide. All right.
So I'm going to go through some of our key findings, and it is an 80-page report, so I'm not going to be going through everything. But in terms of our consultations, we like to keep it simple. I mean, I think that's one of the rules of developmental evaluation is you let the people speak and don't lead too much. So we just had an icebreaker about what people felt like they needed from their job. And one of the interesting things that I found was that it was over 60% when they talked about what they needed in terms of employment were all self-derived. It wasn't about what they needed from other people. It was what they needed from themselves. I think that says a lot about the young people in this province. We talked about education and employment and the common themes and challenges. They were long and robust conversations about that. So there's a whole lot of details in the report, too much to get into now. And then we asked about what they wanted to see in the future. If they had a magic wand and they could get anything for employment or education in their community, what would they ask for? And one of the things that I found really startling about that was that not one suggestion was unrealistic. It was a magic wand. You could do anything. And they only asked for things that were actually really realistic and things that should be there anyway. And so then that was in the first round. And in the second round, we added a couple of other questions because COVID-19 was in full swing. So we really wanted to know, how is it affecting you here in your community? And we got some really interesting results from that, especially around education and hurdles around education and hybrid learning. A lot of appreciation for online learning, but it's not there yet. It's not where it needs to be. From our surveys, unfortunately, we only have 23% of fully employed young people between the age of 18 and 29, which is pretty startling. Most of them are working summer gigs. It's really easy to find work in the summer. And then for the rest of the year, they either have to go to school or they're in a precarious state. 81% found that the economy is worse now after the pandemic than before. So it's a stark issue for a lot of folks. They know that the economy is in trouble and has been for a long time. There was a massive increase in mental health concerns. So many different situations that are very specific that it's from an evaluator's point of view, it's really hard to code that and just put it into a column of an Excel spreadsheet. When people are saying things like, I wasn't allowed to travel to my neighboring town to see my dying grandfather, or I had to move home with my parents who I find abusive. Those are the kinds of situations that you can't just put that in a spreadsheet, you know, and it's hard to hear. So there was a lot of hardship around mental health concerns. A lot of people talked about the sense of isolation and separation from their community. So with that, there's a much higher demand for better and more diverse work opportunities. It's great if there's work, but if it's not the right work, they're not going to want to do it. And right now, with a mental health crisis to the level it is, they're not mentally prepared to go and work at say a fast food restaurant that's going to pay minimum wage and be a very difficult, stressful job. They want more diversified and increased access to educational programs. So like I said about the hybrid learning, there's a lot of appreciation for being able to stay home. That's great, especially staying home in community. That's underlined great. But there are a lot of issues with how online learning works right now. There's often a big emphasis of do it on your own, and we will see you on the other side, without any real support. Just go and do it. And then there's also a big issue with, and to no fault of their own, but for educators who don't know how to use that technology adequately yet, because it is just too new. I mean, it was a fast pivot, and I think everyone should be grateful for being able to pivot to an online learning model, but obviously we're not there yet in terms of actually offering the education that folks need that will put them from an education place to an employment space. And so then also access to mental and physical health support was really strongly, emphatically requested. Folks are hurting and they need help. And we need to up our game because it's not there enough yet. There's too many voices, because one of the big things from an evaluator lens, we heard from a lot of folks, but we only heard from people who are ready to talk. What about all the ones that aren't? What about all the ones that say, I'm not going to do an online survey? What about the ones that say, I don't have the literacy level to do an online survey? Or I am not the kind of person who's going to go to a focus group outside of my comfort zone and tell you my story. So thinking about all of those folks, the unheard, they're going to need a lot more mental health support to get them to where they need to be and where we need them to be. Next slide. Okay, so mental health. Am I covering this? I think I'm covering this. I'll keep going. All right, I'll keep going. So 60, and so this is comparing some of the data that we collected for the Forward Together report in 2020. that I mentioned earlier that I did the lit review for. And so 67% of youth felt that their mental health is impacted by COVID-19, increased. Even though it feels like the pandemic is ending, people are still feeling really stressed about it, because as much as hospital cases are going down, I can't even say if COVID cases are going down because we don't really know. That's probably part of what's making people anxious. The anxiety and the results are still there. They're still being felt, and they're being felt stronger as we move away. So that was a really big, I was surprised, to be honest, when I saw the data. I thought it would go down. I thought that things were getting better. People are still feeling it, and they're feeling it a lot. So in terms of unemployment, 61% of youth were unemployed at the time of the survey, and now 44% of youth were unemployed, 34% were looking for work. And one of the things that I got asked recently was why, if people are saying there's not enough employees for our jobs, how come there's so many unemployed people? If there's work, we've got work, and it's a twofold problem. I think Chelsey answered that very adequately by talking about, if I am a young person who has how many barriers to employment, and then I have to go and work for a job that's going to pay not a living wage, is going to be high stress, high difficulty, and with a high turnover rate, in an environment that stigmatizes me for being a young person. But then also all the pragmatic parts of it, of like, that is at a restaurant that's 45 minutes away, so I have to drive. I don't have a vehicle. I can't afford insurance because I don't have the job. And so you can see that it's not that they don't want to work. It's that the work that we're providing them isn't actually addressing the needs that they have in order to work. So there's a huge gap there. And one of the big problems that we've been seeing is that that gap is growing. And so then in terms of the economy, 79% of the youth said that they feel worse about the Newfoundland economy before the pandemic. That has risen to 81%. And so I think that a lot of the folks here know that we want to have the bravest face when it comes to opportunity and prosperity for this province. We want to have a lot of ambition and hope, and I think that hope is a good thing. But I also think that everyone in this room knows that the Newfoundland economy, and Newfoundland and Labrador economy, sorry, has never been as strong as we want it to be. And young people know it. And we're not able to hide that from them. It's very clear that to young people that there's a rough road ahead for us to get to the prosperity that we all dream of. Next slide.
Okay, so now we're at the space of like recommendations, all the things that we kind of looked at our training, our applied training, developed that model, tested that model, evaluated the model, and it's really now embedded in practice and how we do our work. Taking the research, the consultations, the lit review, really examining and doing a proper analysis of all of those things. That's how we came up with these recommendations. And one is kind of clear and at the top of the list, which is a coordinated transformational economic development implementation plan that prioritizes youth for the future of work. And our call to action on this is that it's got to be a nonpartisan approach to inclusive economic development. We have to be thinking about what it means to what the future of this province looks like and include those who are in the future in the plan. When you look at community economic development, there are many plans that come forward, and we move through them and we move through the strategy. And I think sometimes they oftentimes are based on opportunity, which they should be. But when we think about capital C and community, we are thinking about community-based infrastructure and what's required for the communities themselves to generate wealth and to maintain that wealth and to protect, I think, their own futures and what their futures, youth are a big part of those futures. In the face of, in some of the research, there's no, one of the biggest challenges that many communities across this province are facing is their declining population, and then a subsequent brain drain of young people leaving communities. And so, but interestingly enough, from the research, many young people are citing, particularly in the pandemic, of a desire to stay. So isn't that an incredible opportunity? So it's going forward with, that 10-year plan that's going to take, I think Sharon said it last night, all hands on deck. It's going to take everybody, it's going to take all of us in community, all political parties to really rally around what we want the future of this province to look like and who needs to be prioritized in what that future looks like, and design how we get there. When we think about community economic development as there's a subcategory to that, to really prioritize young people in entrepreneurship. So Constanza talked so beautifully today around her journey into entrepreneurship as a new Canadian. And I think, interestingly enough, a lot of young people don't necessarily see themselves in entrepreneurship as part of the solution. And so part of that is that the infrastructure in which to really inspire that entrepreneurial thinking, that innovative thinking, the disposition and confidence that it takes to really formulate that and actualize that. We have some infrastructure, certainly with Youth Ventures and CBDC. It's such an incredible program. Thinking about building on those kinds of initiatives, embedding it into the education system, but then also thinking about what it takes for a young person to start a business, get a business up and off the ground and contribute in their community, and really understanding how we support those actions. And remember, entrepreneurs, contrary to popular belief, entrepreneurs aren't all tech entrepreneurs, trying to scale across the universe and do those things. Entrepreneurs are people in our communities. They're the folks that are neighbors. They're your electrician. They're your doctor, if you're lucky enough to have one. They're your coffee shop. They're your credit union, and I think we sometimes do this thing, especially when we're planning and we're strategizing. We think about the big stuff. And I remember once being an entrepreneur many moons ago, and somebody saying to me once, well, you're just a lifestyle business. And that's true. I owned a retail store and it was wicked. I loved my life. And it's true. I got to do what I wanted to do. And they said, it's just a lifestyle business. It's not scalable. I'm not interested. And I remember being like, well, I'm not interested in you. But we don't do a great job at it, that idea, the idea of the binary sense of you're a lifestyle entrepreneur or a tech entrepreneur. It's all entrepreneurship is important to this province. I think that the stat is something like 89% of people work in small business across Newfoundland and Labrador. So what is the lifeblood of communities, and what are the things we all interact with? We interact with economy. And if we start being more purposeful about how we generate wealth and how we retain that wealth in communities, we're all going to be better for that. Moving into the educational options, as Matthew said, I won't spend too much time on. Matthew said, that hybrid option is working for folks. We have to think about digital inclusion when we think about, persons with disabilities. We have to think about digital inclusion for folks who perhaps maybe don't have access to Wi-Fi, or maybe don't have access to these things, devices, and those. So as we move intentionally into that virtual space more, we do have to also have the coordinated investments to be able to do that. When we think about community level funding and investment, this is in, the community entities that are doing this really hard work, ensuring that things aren't project to project, that there are ways to maintain projects through and take the time to have initiatives that you can then see fruitful outcomes from. I think Corey Foley, who's going to speak to you a little bit later, and he always says, this shit takes time. And I agree with you, Corey, that this idea that it takes time to move course and move the direction. The rudder doesn't just like, move it and then it's like, bam, we're going this way. It's just not like that. The time and effort it takes to move things, the dial. And so those community organizations having that consistent investment and thinking about different ways of doing that and different ways of investing in the community organizations who really lift these folks up. Thinking about a coordinated skills development strategy for youth, and that's really looking at the 21st century skills. And interestingly enough, the technical skills required, we have a lot of young people have those technical skills kind of in hand. But one of the challenges is in the 21st century learning kind of framework, it's about adaptability, flexibility, it's about communication, it's about really those power skills, and that's where we designed those power skills from. And when we think about skills development, we do have to think about what it takes and what it means to build on or point out resilience that already exists or that folks are building up. The investing in wraparound youth mental health supports is such a critical one. The thing that we heard over and over again in the research, every time we went out to talk to young people, mental health was at the top of the list. It was one of the major concerns young people have for themselves. It is one of the major concerns and then subsequently that we should have for young people, is that those access to those supports are not necessarily there, and the ones that are there need to be further invested in so that young people have the access to the supports they need. And then finally, and this one was like just straight up in your face, the investing in a basic income came loud and clear through the research. And when you think about a basic income for a young person, it makes for anybody, but young people in particular, if you are in a moment of transition, young people often identify those moments where they get stuck. And so the idea that you could have a basic income in which you could then try things, and we could do that equitably so that it wouldn't be just driven by privilege, that folks who have a basic income can explore options for themselves. They can feed their families, they can maintain their housing. And when you do that, imagine what actualization can happen. Imagine what that could look like. And so we heard loud and clear for them. So that's why we're telling you. Next slide.
Well, I'll take this one. And in the interest of time, we are getting close to the lunch hour. So I'm going to bomb through a little bit so we get a few questions and answers before we move on. We're going to save our fireside chat till after lunch, and we'll keep things moving. Our unexpected learning. So what are the things that came out of our research and our piloting that we weren't expecting? Well, COVID-19 made a huge difference to the research project. Of course, it was very hard to gather people to actually get those consults together. How many plane tickets did I cancel in the pandemic when we just couldn't? We'd be free and clear, and then we're back in lockdown. So it was very challenging to gather young people for sure in that environment. We had barriers to ethics. Our ethics approval included a consent form that was very much a legalese document, and when we presented it to young people, they were very reluctant to read it, to understand it. They were very reluctant to sign it. So we went back to ethics again and said, how can we pivot on this? We produced a new consent form that was a little simpler, a little easier to understand, a little more user-friendly. Again, young people were very, very put off by this document. And so inevitably, what we decided upon was a very simple verbal consent and a sign-in form. And that worked best for the young people that we were dealing with. Partnerships. So initially, we intended to run these programs kind of on our own, but then we realized that that's not really feasible, and nor is it really the best path to follow. The best path for us to follow to test our programming off the Avalon, outside of the metro region, was to partner with the good people that are already doing phenomenal work on the ground in these communities. And not only were we able to come in and support the great work they were doing with some of our programming and some of our findings, but we actually learned a great deal from the work that's happening across this province, which was an unexpected but very, very happy discovery. And technological barriers. I think Matt spoke a little bit about this earlier. When the pandemic and the lockdown started, we did try to switch to a virtual model for our consultations and for our training. And what we found was that there were a huge number of young people that didn't have access to technology, that may have had a cell phone but did not have access to Wi-Fi. And furthermore, young people that were facing barriers to employment it was very hard for us to build strong relationships in a virtual landscape. So there's definitely some work to be done there for sure. Next slide. Do you want me to take this one? Okay, go for it.
Super quick. We are when we talk about live opportunities, our recommendations are one thing. There's a bit, they take a little bit more to do, but the live opportunities are the things that are right in front of us, and they're important to identify and tease out. Really thinking about decreasing the urban-rural divide by improving access to services, opportunities, and training. Like if we are thinking about doing this right and doing it right by community, we have to think about improving the access points for folks, especially folks who decide they would like to stay in their communities. There's a very live opportunity to use social enterprise as a tool for labor market development intentionally. Work integrated social enterprises really do offer a really interesting way in which you can train, support, and support young people in particular, but then at the same time be able to wrap the necessary supports around them so that they can meet their goals, whatever that looks like. We've seen the model, we've lived the model, we've now proven the model works. And so we really, that is the live opportunity. So social enterprises that exist, they need investment to be able to do this work really well, but they also bring a hell of a lot to the table in terms of economic empowerment of communities and potential growth for those social enterprises. So a small investment goes a hell of a long way and is a really smart way of thinking through good labor market attachment. Leveraging employment training models for scale, thinking about the additional capacity required to do that. So if this is a model, our programming model is one that we can share and we could scale out, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. And how, we can support other folks in adopting the model, happy to do it. We think that there's a real great opportunity to pilot something, but there's no sense of piloting it unless you're going to evaluate it. And so if there is an appetite for, taking that model, building on and iterating that model for scale, we're happy to do that. That's the point of the research. And then we would, certainly support that within using some evaluation mechanism to just make sure that it's working across programs and across systems. I think that's a real live opportunity. And then finally, in provincial strategy that prioritizes youth and the future of work. I think that perspective would be essential and really connect. It's something that's not really necessarily being spoken about. The NLWIC team are incredible banging that drum, but we need to think about how the interconnectivity of all of these things function together. And it really culminates, I think, to the future of work because it connects with our social, our economic well-being, and it also prioritizing youth is also part of the equity prioritization. Next slide. I'll move through these super quick. So the impacts on future research, we really need to think about the barriers to education. The change in technology is really assisting with that, although we need to prioritize that inclusion, the technology inclusion. We can look at diverse models for hybrid learning, thinking about different ways of doing that. We know that work is changing. I mean, all of your work environments have probably changed where you're moving to hybrid models or maybe they're changing, but the people inside them are changing and wanting things that are different. Got to recognize it and acknowledge it, but strategize from there. And then youth, we know from the research that youth they're feeling less optimistic about their economic future here in the province, which is massively problematic. This should be a very scary statistic for everybody in the room. And they're also feeling particularly their mental health has decreased or their concerns certainly have increased around their mental health in a post-COVID-19 world. And so those are two things that we have to really think about when strategizing what the future of work looks like for young people. And that's why it's so critical that that strategy be prioritized. Next slide, because I think we're done. No, we're not. At any rate, we're going to skip over this one because it's really about the Q&A. It's really about questions you folks might have for us. I want to say a big thank you. I'm really looking forward to our fireside chat after lunch. Corey and Kirkland are going to be joining us. Rory is going to be moderating, and you'll be able to really ask a lot of questions and hear Kirkland's story and Rory's and Corey's experience, somebody who works directly with young people every single day.
Thanks so much to our panelists. A really interesting presentation. I've heard it 3 times now, and I'm still like, ooh, pick up on different things every time. So greatly appreciated. We are going to turn over to questions and answers. So anyone in the audience that has a question or a comment that they'd like to share.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Pauline Maxwell. I'm department head for all new program development at Academy Canada and Eastern Academy within the province. Excellent presentation, and hats off to you guys. Wow. You've certainly been moving, and some great work done there. So hats off to all of you. One of the first question that I have, or main question, you talk about your target group are youth, and your youth is in the range of 18 to 29. So it is mentioned that you consulted with 650 plus people. From my personal, I guess, and professional experience, that age range, 18 to 29, I can see like an 18-year-old having very different needs than a 29-year-old. My question to you through your research, do you have a breakdown of your respondents, that of those 650 people of, what age group like participated? So I'm looking forward to see if they are mostly like under the 25 or over the 25 sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a demographic breakdown in our report, which will be available we'll make sure everybody gets it. It is will be available probably early next week. And I can say that like the demographic spread was really interesting because you're right, 18-year-old versus 29-year-old, that looks so different. Our median age was around 24. In terms of our respondents. However, interestingly enough, during the pandemic, even in our programs, our ages started to skew really young, really quick. So in our programs, typically our median age is usually goes somewhere between like 21 and 23. Coming through the pandemic, all of a sudden, the ages of folks in our training programs that we were piloting skyrocketed on the like 16 to 20-year-olds. And so our age mandate for Choices for Youth is 16 to 29. And so having 16-year-olds knock on your door and want training jobs, they've detached from high school, like during the pandemic when the high schools were shut down, that was a really interesting moment for us because we said, oh my goodness, usually we work with 18 and above because we really, if someone is of school age and they're not in school, then we try our best to get them back to school. So typically they don't actually hit the employment-based programs. However, that in the time of COVID, seeing that massive change in the age demographic, really like, and given that schools were closed, we kind of knew why. So we saw a huge spike in those younger people coming and needing substantial supports, but then also looking for a job, which was really enlightening. So we'll have that demographic spread so you can take a look at that, of what that looks like, but you're totally right. The needs are really diverse. The other diversity on the demographic side of things, which we found in the first survey we did during COVID-19, was that a lot of the respondents that we received were folks, it was almost like the definition of vulnerability, really like COVID-19 was this not equalizer in a really bad way, but it just meant that like young people just felt this vulnerability very different. And now some of our respondents, and then subsequent, a lot of the young people connected with us, we saw a huge spike in folks who were in post-secondary. So folks who are in college, folks who are in university, even to some degree, folks in like master's programs coming to us saying, we'd like to explore education, like to explore a job with you folks. And it provided the population that we didn't, to be honest, we like a lot of young people who come to us really experience that like high degree of marginalization and aren't usually in those. We're usually trying to support young people to get to that stage. But what happened, I think, with COVID-19 is there's just no matter where you were or what you were doing, or that all of a sudden folks were young people were more vulnerable than ever, because all of a sudden all the things, the structures that they were part of were now changed and disrupted completely. And so we actually saw a spike in respondents for folks from post-secondary who were really citing like some really important feedback. So oftentimes, when we do this research, we don't necessarily hear from that population as much. But with COVID, I think that just given the extreme way COVID disrupted young people's lives, period, we saw respondents from those areas go way up.
Thanks so much, Chelsey, and thanks for the great question. Any other questions from the floor, and then we'll go to any questions that we may be getting online. Matt, any questions from folks over your way? Oh, perfect.
Okay, the questions aren't to anybody specific on the panel, so anybody can chime in. The first one is from Jade, and Jade is the clinical occupational therapist at one of the mental health and addiction centers for youth in our province, Hope Valley Center. Jade says, I've noticed a great need to reintegrate youth into their communities from a pro-social and vocational perspective. I love that your organization has built partnerships in various areas of the province. I apologize if I missed this detail, but I'm wondering if more partnerships will be built, for example, in different areas such as the Central Region.
Love that question, Jade. And I think, in our recommendations, that's part of it. The idea that we can scale out is something we should all be kind of thinking about. I think we're so much stronger when we work together. This is what this research is intended to do. So we create a model that can be replicated, that can be supported in community by community champions. And that's our hope. Like, if everybody here could take away something from today, is that the hope is that we are better together. This is the point of the research, and this is how we see this being disseminated is in practice, not necessarily in these schmancy panels, even though I really like you guys. We want to see the work get into community, and we want to see it get into community with the community partners that can benefit from it to support their young people that they work with.
Excellent. Okay, our next question comes from Reza from the Tamarack Institute. And they say, in our national program, we're seeing similar trends and recommendations emerging. One thing I'm wondering is, how do we support and train, quote, adult allies to be able to provide this type of support to engage young people where they are and to involve them in research and these programs?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I know that in my role as the training and employment lead at Choices for Youth, my capacity has been increased exponentially in the past 3 or 4 years. So I've suddenly found myself going from a team of 1 to having a team of 5. And a lot of it is, I think, is about making sure that you look for that human-centered design, look for that concept of putting the beneficiary first. What does the client really want and need, and listening and using restorative justice to provide them with voice, and taking that information and really using empathy to move forward. I think without those 3 key components, you're going to have trouble building relationships. And without the relationships, you're never going to get the training and the back and forth and the conversation and the mutual learning that's necessary. I hope that answered the question. Oh, Chelsey can add. I can feel her hand reaching for my microphone to take it away from me. Here she comes. But I will say that there's no, I don't think that there's a I don't think there's a magic recipe to get there. But I think for me, those are the key elements: meeting young people where they are and knowing when to step back and listen. And I think if you're able to do that, you can learn a lot and you can help a young person succeed.
Thank you, Rory. No, I think to that question. So here, I'm a pretty optimistic person. So here's what I'm hopeful for. I'm hopeful for that we'll be able to, these calls to action will culminate to the youth employment strategy at the federal level. So I think if that strategy involves more flexible funding, involves opportunities for folks in community to iterate, to try things, that the outcomes aren't as prescriptive as they have been. And there's a recognition that the social determinants of health are a critical part of employment. If those things are recognized in the funding structures, then we have a hope in hell to move the dial on it. And so I specifically target the youth employment strategy because at a federal level, it is the big youth employment strategy that, you know, if those structures have put the resources in the hands of community and community can then design how those interventions need to look by leveraging the understanding that they have or the agency of young people. If we see that all permeate in the right way and the stars align and all the things line up, then maybe there's an opportunity to really activate this, not just in our province, but on a federal level and really think about prioritizing youth in the future of work. I think on a provincial level, there's also the same applies. So if we think about how we do our employment-based programs here in the province and how the province funds them, I do think that, again, prioritizing that investment, those community investments, empowering the organizations themselves to design programs that work for people, that work for whatever population you're working with. I think that and to open up what's possible, because the communities know this work. They know this work inside and out. And so unfortunately, sometimes project to project, someone described it as being a contortionist. It's like, I'm going to do this project and then I'm going to reshape it and do that project. And we end up without the consistency that's required to really move the dial on some of these complex challenges. And so if we start thinking differently, but we start acting differently, we might get to a different spot. And that's what I'm really hopeful for. And I think it's an opportunity of what's possible. The last thing I'll say of how to action this is for the folks of the NLWIC team, doing these research projects is critical. Having the work be done by community is critical. Having it disseminated, having events like today, this is how we get there. And so if all those things are kind of working together, I think we can do it. Okay.
One last thing in terms of training or helping adult allies, to add on to Rory's is active listening, and really truly active listen. I think that it's in our natural compulsion to try to guide and handhold and push, and we no, stop, just listen really intently. Thanks.
Okay, we have one last question from the chat from Rebecca Thistle, and they say, this seemed to be an excellent use of developmental evaluation. Based on your experience, do you have any advice on how to run a developmental evaluation with other programs?
Absolutely. So I think an easy first step is to go online and check out. There's a DE primer, and there is an updated version. And so the initial DE primer that was put out by, I believe it was put out by McConnell. Thanks. Okay, cool. Yeah, it was McConnell. It really goes through what developmental evaluation is and what it isn't, and some really good case studies for where it's applicable and where it's not. Because it's not for every single project, right? It is specifically for high innovation and high change. And then the main feedback that they got from that primer was that, okay, this is great, but like, how do you do it? Like, where's the methodology component? Because what's interesting about developmental evaluation is that your methodology will change every single project. To what Chelsey just said about being a contortionist, your evaluation plan for, say, a food security program is going to be in rural anywhere, is going to be completely different than, say, a urban make work project, right? So you need to have that flexibility, and so that but when they were asked, like, well, I want steps, I want something concrete, and the problem is that what we see in this world is there's not as much concrete stuff as we think there is, and so being flexible is one of the most key components. Having active sense making sessions is another key component to good developmental evaluation, so that you're getting people together and saying, so what did you do? How did it do? What should we do? And so that's another key component. So when they got that feedback in true DE fashion, they came back with an updated kind of a redo. And and so that has more of the methodology in it to direct people on, like, how do you develop your developmental evaluation plan? And often it does start with what I just said about active listening. You get the stakeholders. Sometimes folks don't like the word stakeholders, because who really is the stakeholder? It's not just funders. It's not just the people who are directly involved, but it's also all of the people who are impacted by what you're doing. And that's an important component. So you got to talk to those people and listen carefully. And that from there, you can really get into the teeth of what are the most crucial questions that you have to ask, and what is the best evidence to answer them.
We just have one more. Oh, you want to go for it?
I was just going to add on that active listening is so important. And if you're actively listening right now, you'll probably hearing my stomach grumble because it's lunchtime. But we've definitely got time for one more question. Absolutely.
Correct. I'm just going to go over to Sharon for one last.
Yeah.
Hi, this has been fabulous. Thank you very much. I just wanted to, I guess, reiterate that it is NLWIC's commitment and our mandate to ensure that the research, which is one of our 6 core activities, but an important one, that the results of the research doesn't sit on a shelf. It has to be shared, and it has to be shared so it can be adopted as new policies, programs, or service delivery models by government and other organizations. And so it can be replicated where possible and to be scaled. I'm going to say scaled up and scaled out and scaled deep where necessary, because it's all about using all of that to have an expanded, diverse, and inclusive and workforce that's going to, propel our economy forward. So we're all more prosperous socially and economically.